Hello everybody, welcome to Totally Tabled. My name is Shaggy, and today I'm going to give you my quick first impressions of Inventions, Evolution of Ideas. I made a full solo playthrough of Inventions, so please go check that out if you haven't, because in this video I'm going to assume you've either watched that playthrough or you know how the game works. I've only played Inventions 4 times, and they've all been solo, so please keep that in mind as you listen to my thoughts. Also keep in mind that I'm a huge fan of heavy Euro games and Vital Lacerda heavy Euro games in particular. So I'm kind of hardwired to enjoy Inventions, and no surprises, I absolutely love it. In fact, in my opinion, this is Vital Lacerda's best game for solo play to date. It's certainly my favorite. Clearly, his games are designed around a multiplayer experience first, with solo being a secondary mode. And personally, multiplayer is my preferred way of playing Lacerda games. All things being equal, I'd want, 4 players for Kanban, and, maybe 3 for the Gallerist and Vinos, and probably 2 for Lisboa and on Mars. 2 or 3, all of his games play great at 3. I think Weather Machine was maybe the first time where I felt like solo was on par with multiplayer for me personally. Now with Inventions, solo is my preferred way to play. And you have to keep in mind, again, I have not played it multiplayer, so take this with a grain of salt. But the reason I say that is due entirely to, what is the star mechanism in Inventions, which is the action chaining system. This system lets you take an action and then spin a chain token in order to take another action. But each action allows you to chain into other actions in different ways. Some actions like inventing or sharing an invention don't allow you to chain at all, right? They're kind of dead ends. And some actions let you take other actions without needing a chain token at all, like presenting an idea or the Eureka action, for example. And you're limited in how many chain actions you can take, right? The number is tied to your influence. So you need to be building up your influence over the course of the game in order to perform those super turns where you're just taking chain after chain after chain. By the end of the game, it is very possible to be taking 6 or 7 actions on a single turn. And when you pull that off, it feels amazing. You really have to think of your turn as a journey of actions. Oftentimes, I know where I want my destination to be, but there are usually multiple journeys that can take me there, right? Like I might really want to invent an idea. Well, if I have 2 chain tokens, I could probably come up with an epic journey of actions that will end in inventing, depending on where I'm able to place my pillar. Unlike a lot of worker placement or action selection games where, you're going to place your worker, in this case a pillar, onto an action, and then that's going to be the action that you take, here, your pillar action is just the beginning of that journey. And I really like how the pillar restrictions work because, other than the first round of the game, you're limited to 8 of the 10 actions, and then 6 of the 10, and then 4. And because your opponent isn't blocking you, you're just blocking yourself, you're able to plan all 3 of your pillar movements at the beginning of each era. Obviously, changes in the board state might change what you want to do, but ultimately, you're in control, unlike a lot of worker placement games. You can make long-term plans, or at least, era long-term plans, and then pivot tactically, and I really like that. And when you couple the pillar system with the chaining system, there always seems to be a way to get around being blocked from an action. There just always seems to be some journey that you can take to get you where you want to go. But finding it isn't always easy or obvious. One of my favorite things in board gaming is comboing and coming up with these convoluted, unexpected ways of accomplishing goals, especially when you can set those things up in advance. And in Inventions, that's a fundamental part of the design. It's central to the game. For me, I can't ask for anything more, which is why I was surprised to read a bunch of comments complaining about the chaining system. And most of those complaints centered around just how much AP players can get trying to come up with those journeys. Because it's not good enough to just take an action, right? You need to take multiple actions, and that can definitely lead to a ton of analysis paralysis. In a 4-player game, that would be unbearable. But that's the great thing about playing solo. There is no AP. There's just A. And you can analyze to your heart's content because there's nobody waiting for you. Overanalyzing and pondering your turn is one of the joys of solo gaming. And the chaining system encourages that. It's a boon for solo play, but it's definitely a detriment to multiplayer play, particularly for those first games where reading the board and seeing those journeys is really going to take a lot of time. Now that goes away. After a few plays, you start to see those journeys much more easily. They make sense. You understand where journeys need to start, where they need to end. And honestly, the design of the game works really well to make that information really visible and easy to read once you know what to look for, once you have a little bit of experience under your belt. I think a lot of the negative comments I was reading were probably mostly first play opinions and overreactions. And honestly, like, I'll be blunt, I just don't care about your opinions after one play. Like, yes, this is a heavy Euro game. Your first play is going to be rough. Like, no kidding. Those thoughts just are worse than useless, and they might give someone the false impression of what the game feels like, once you get over that initial learning curve. I'm giving my first impressions of games after, 3 to 5 plays, 4 plays in this case. Even that's not enough for me to be comfortable calling it a full review. So just know that this chaining system, the AP becomes better. But still, this is not a game I'd want to play at 4 ever, or even 3 really. Just as a quick little side note here, an example of what I would consider to be a first play opinion that you may run into out there, I'm not sure, is this idea that the inventing action is weak somehow, or not as strong as some of the other actions. And it's funny because, I felt the same way in my first play. But then the game opened up, and I saw how everything fits together. The fact is, inventing is critical to filling up your board, your progress board, and scoring those wealth tiles, and completing goals, and getting those tech tiles, which, again, seem weak at first, but once you get a little bit of experience, you see just how extremely valuable those can be. They're letting you take multiple core actions. So that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about when I talk about first play overreactions. And similarly, I think calling this, one of his more complex games is also maybe a little bit of that first play overreaction. There's a lot of rules, that's par for the course. First play is going to be a little rough. I think the rule book is extremely well done. There's a few small, issues here or there. That's, again, to be expected. After a few games, it really comes together. Things start to make sense. And in my opinion, I found it easier to play, more streamlined, and more straightforward than many of his games. Now, again, that's coming from someone with a lot of experience playing these games. But the way you score points, the way you get those tiles, your goals, the way an idea gets invented and then gets innovated upon and then gets shared, that whole cycle, that whole evolution, it's pretty straightforward, especially compared to something like Kanban, where, getting those cars out and the designs and testing the design and all that stuff, that's a much more convoluted process. And once again, Ian O'Toole has done a fantastic job of laying everything out. The icons, the graphic design, everything is really visually clear. Apart from just a couple of things, the steps of each action are laid out both in icons on the board and then in words with these little player aids off to the side. Again, after those first couple of plays, it really comes together and makes sense. The complexity really lies in the chaining, in the idea that, okay, I understand all these 10 actions, but now I'm doing 4 of them. I'm doing 5 of them, one after the other. So to my mind, I think this one is easier to pick up than, say, Weather Machine, or even on Mars for that matter. I also find that the theme helps. I know what people are going to say. They're going to say that this game isn't thematic, that it lacks some of the thematic connections that are, I think, hallmarks of Lacerda's earlier designs. And I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think what's different here is that in so many of Lacerda's games, the theme is typically zoomed in. You play as a worker in a car factory, or as the owner of a gallery, or as a winemaker. You're often one character moving around. It's very zoomed in. Here, we've zoomed all the way out. You know, no more attending meetings and getting yelled at by your boss. No, we're covering the scope of human history. You're no longer a character, but rather, you know, one of these godlike forces that we get to play in so many different board games. And so because of that, it definitely sort of feels less thematic. But I think the theme actually helps to learn the game and to understand the systems. The idea of getting these milestones and using those to create ideas that then get invented, the way these things travel around the world, I don't know, as abstracted as it is, I found that I really enjoyed the theme. But be aware, for you, and I think for maybe many people, this is going to feel like a much less thematic experience than the typical Lacerda. Didn't bother me, but it might bother you. And I think the last thing that I'll talk about here, since I've been babbling on for quite a while, is I found this to be a much less tight and confrontational game than a lot of his others. You know, I never really found myself getting too angsty about what they were taking, where they were going, what actions they were taking. Now, part of that is because, again, you're not being blocked on that main action board with your pillars. You're blocking yourself, so you have so much control. And if you go to one of their spots, you're just giving them 2 points, you know, that's no big deal. Occasionally, it'd be like, oh, I really want to invent that idea. Or I really want to present that invention, not ideal. I really want to present that invention so that I can get that particular wealth tile. So there's definitely moments like that. But because of the chaining, because of how open it is, I always felt like there was a way, no matter what they did, there was a way that I could make it work, do what I wanted to do. Even if it took me a little extra turns, no big deal. Now that's very different than some of Lacerda's other games like Kanban. I always go back to Kanban because it's my favorite, but you know, that is a knife fight in a phone booth. Every move that your opponent makes, you know, you're living and dying by it. So this is a very different vibe, and that could be a negative for some people or a positive, depending on what you're looking for. If you're maybe a couple that really likes heavy games, but you don't want it to be very confrontational and a little bit more live and let live, then this might be exactly what you're looking for. To me, you know, I like both, you know, so I don't necessarily have a preference one way or the other. It was kind of nice as a solo experience because it meant that I could kind of really get into like doing the comboing and sort of getting exactly the combos that I wanted. And I wasn't feeling like, you know, the randomness of the solo opponents were kind of getting in my way arbitrarily or in a frustrating way. Now, that's not to say that the game is easy, because it's not. It's really difficult. Although I think I'm getting better. I'm learning. I also think the solo mode is very well done. You know, you're kind of running 2 opponents, but Kronos is so easy. Entirely predictable. Literally takes 10 seconds once you learn how to do it. Very easy. Hephaestus is more difficult, more lengthy of turns, right? Much more like a regular player, but also straightforward. There aren't like complicated decision trees that you have to parse out, right? You just sort of flip that card. They're going to take an action. They move to the first place where they can take that action. It's not like you're having to decide what's the best place for them. And then they just go through a series of steps. Again, you know, you're not really having to make decisions for them. And I just found the cognitive load in running them was very easy. The most annoying part was really when they get one of those progress tiles, they can't double up. And so you have to check to make sure they don't have that one. And then if they do, you go to the next one. And so that whole process is like a little fiddly. It would be great if they could just like grab one real quick and it was really simple. But that's a minor complaint. I think the solo mode works great. The only last thing that I really want to mention is a warning about replayability, because I know a lot of people conflate replayability with variability. And what I'm about to say here is true of every Lacerda game, I think. The replayability of his games don't necessarily come from extreme levels of variability. With Inventions, it's always going to be the same puzzle, just different. Right? I recently talked a lot about Voidfall, another heavy Euro game. And in that game, there is so much variability. There are so many ways that you can change that game and make it a very different experience. It's like a new, different puzzle. Not just the same puzzle, but different. Inventions is much more along the lines of something like Halls of Hegra. Again, a game that every time you play, it's the same puzzle, but different. For me, despite that lack of variability, I still find Lacerda games to be incredibly replayable because I enjoy the core systems and mechanisms so much. I enjoy the tactical decision making that you have to go through. But I know for some people, they're going to want the sort of the Voidfall, the Robinson Crusoe type of replayability, where you can have vastly different games, game after game. It really depends on what you're looking for. I like both types, and I plan on playing Inventions dozens of times, and I doubt that I'm ever going to get tired of it, but it is something you should be aware of. I can definitely imagine a lot of people feeling like the replayability is lacking. So there you go. I talked way longer than I meant to. You can't get me started on some of these games. I just talk forever. But until next time, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.